They've been lying to you since kindergarten. Be nice and others will be nice back. Earn respect and you'll succeed. Just be yourself, and the world will appreciate you. How's that working out? While you've been busy trying to win popularity, contests, the truly effective operators have been quietly mastering a different game altogether, one that history's most successful leaders have always understood, but few dare discuss openly. What if the most essential ingredient for lasting influence isn't respect but fear? What if your obsessive pursuit of being liked is precisely what's undermining your ability to lead, succeed, and protect what matters most? Look around at who truly gets results. Not who wins momentary applause, but who consistently achieves their objectives despite opposition. The parent whose children actually behave, the manager whose team consistently delivers, the negotiator who walks away with better terms. Their secret isn't superior knowledge or even exceptional charisma. It's their mastery of controlled fear, the psychological force that operates beneath conscious awareness, yet drives human behavior more powerfully than any mission statement or inspirational speech. This isn't about intimidation or cruelty. It's about understanding a fundamental truth of human psychology that most people spend their entire lives denying. The transformation this understanding creates isn't gradual, it's immediate and profound. Relationships recalibrate overnight. Boundaries that you've been struggling to enforce suddenly become self-maintaining. The mental and emotional energy you've been wasting on seeking approval gets redirected toward actual achievement. Within days of applying these principles, you'll experience the strange calm that comes from no longer needing to convince others of your worth. This isn't manipulation. It's liberation from the exhausting game of constant validation seeking that keeps most people trapped in cycles of frustration and underachievement. Ready to discover what Machiavelli knew, what every effective leader practices, and what no one wants to admit they depend on. Notice how certain individuals seem to have an invisible force field around them. Few dare interrupt them, question their authority, or make demands of their time. This protective barrier isn't built through kindness or accommodation. It's constructed through the strategic cultivation of fear. The power of fear as a boundary-setting mechanism exceeds any verbal agreement or written contract. When someone feels that subtle tremor of unease before approaching another, they've already conceded the psychological high ground, creating a natural deterrent more effective than any explicit warning. History's most effective leaders understood this principle instinctively. Consider how Julius Caesar maintained control over vast territories, not primarily through constant military engagement, but through the carefully managed fear of Roman reprisal. Or observe how in corporate environments, the executives whose time is most respected aren't those who politely request space, but those who have demonstrated consequences for those who waste their resources. This form of boundary setting operates below conscious awareness, creating a subconscious calculation in others. Is this interaction worth the potential discomfort or risk? What separates this approach from mere intimidation is its selective application. The masterful practitioner doesn't radiate hostility indiscriminately. They simply ensure that crossing their boundaries carries an unpredictable but potentially significant cost. Like a homeowner who doesn't need a high fence because the neighborhood knows their property is monitored, the person who establishes fear-based boundaries enjoys protection without constant maintenance. The question then becomes not whether this dynamic exists in every human interaction, but how consciously one chooses to manage it. John walked into the board meeting 10 minutes late, mumbling an apology no one acknowledged. When Sarah entered, 5 minutes later the entire room fell silent, including the CEO. John had spent years building relationships, showing competence, and earning what he thought was respect. Sarah had been there just 6 months but had established something far more potent. The difference? John had cultivated optional respect. Sarah had installed mandatory fear. The psychological control underlying this distinction explains why some people's requests get immediate action, while others are perpetually considered. Consider the stark contrast between how people interact with those they merely respect versus those they subtly fear. Respect operates on convenience. People follow a respected leader when it aligns with their interests but find excuses when it doesn't. Fear, however, compels action regardless of personal preference. Look at how students complete assignments, for certain professors while neglecting others, how employees prioritize some managers' requests over others despite equal official authority. The power dynamics at play aren't about formal position, but psychological positioning. The fear of potential consequences outweighs the desire for approval. The most fascinating element of this dynamic is how rarely it requires explicit demonstration, like a skilled poker player who only occasionally shows their winning hand. Those who understand this principle need only demonstrate their capacity for controlled consequences in select moments. The ancient Chinese strategist Sun Tzu captured this perfectly. Kill one, terrify 1,000. Modern translation: one clear boundary enforcement creates 1,000 moments where no enforcement is needed. But this raises an essential question about the strategic application of such force. Florence, 1502. A province spirals into chaos. Theft, murder, and corruption run rampant despite years of gentle leadership. Cesare Borgia, Machiavelli's most studied subject, arrives and appoints a ruthless lieutenant who swiftly executes the top troublemakers. Order returns overnight. Then, in a masterful stroke, Borgia publicly executes his own lieutenant for excessive cruelty, leaving the citizens both peaceful and grateful. This wasn't random brutality. It was surgical power application followed by a calculated display of justice. Machiavelli observed that Borgia accomplished with one sequence what years of compassionate governance had failed to achieve. This episode reveals the paradoxical truth that controlled demonstrations of force often create more humane outcomes than perpetual niceness. Consider how a classroom falls into disorder under a teacher who never disciplines but stabilizes under one who establishes clear consequences early. The pattern repeats across history. Augustus establishing the Pax Romana after targeted purges, Lincoln suspending habeas corpus to ultimately preserve the Union, or how Singapore transformed from a crime-ridden port to one of the world's safest cities through initially strict enforcement. The fear created through limited, predictable consequences creates the foundation for long-term security. What most misunderstand about Machiavelli's insight is its ultimate purpose, not to create suffering but to minimize it. When everyone fears consequences equally, fewer people experience them. The parent who follows through on punishments early has children who require fewer punishments later. The manager who fires one persistently underperforming employee motivates 20 others without saying a word. The counterintuitive truth emerges. Selective demonstrations of power create environments where power needs to be used less frequently. Yet this raises profound questions about the psychological mechanisms at work when people encounter someone with this capacity. Mark was shaking slightly as he waited outside the CEO's office. Strange, he thought, since he'd never even met the woman. Inside, however, was Jennifer Hayes, who'd built an empire not through screaming or threats but through something far more powerful: strategic silence. In meetings, she'd let uncomfortable pauses stretch until anxious executives filled them with concessions. When faced with ultimatums, she'd simply stare, expressionless, until the other party nervously reduced their demands. Her power came not from what she did, but what others feared she might do. Without ever raising her voice, she'd created a psychological environment where everyone around her projected their own fears onto her unreadable canvas. This unconscious projection explains why certain individuals command immediate authority upon entering any room. Humans evolved to be intensely sensitive to potential threats. When someone's reactions remain unpredictable, our primitive brain fills the gap with worst-case scenarios. Consider studies showing that participants rate emotionally reserved individuals as more competent, intelligent, and powerful than expressive peers with identical credentials, or how patients report more confidence in doctors with detached demeanors than those who display warmth but identical expertise. The control over one's emotional display creates a power vacuum that others fill with assumed authority. The master practitioners of this approach understand a fundamental truth. Humans fear uncertainty more than known negatives. That's why the boss who occasionally explodes is less intimidating than the one who remains calm, but whose thoughts seem impenetrable. It's why the poker player who never reveals excitement or disappointment consistently outperforms more skilled but transparent Opponents. The uncertainty principle operates everywhere, from dating, the person who cares less sets the terms, to international relations. Nations fear unpredictable adversaries more than predictably hostile ones. But this approach comes with a warning label that few discuss. David always got the worst assignments at Meridian Consulting. Despite his Harvard MBA and brilliant analyses, colleagues interrupted him in meetings, clients demanded unreasonable revisions, and his team consistently missed deadlines without consequences. Down the hall, Sophia, with identical credentials, never experienced these problems. The difference? David believed his competence and kindness would naturally earn respect. Sophia understood the dark truth. Unchecked kindness isn't interpreted as strength, but as a permission slip for exploitation. One Friday evening, after finding himself yet again making corrections to a subordinate's rushed work while everyone else headed to happy hour, David finally confronted the costly illusion that had defined his career. The psychological principle at play operates across all hierarchies, from playground to boardroom. Excessive accommodation activates what biologists call the dominance testing response, a hardwired tendency to push boundaries until resistance is encountered. Like water seeking the path of least resistance, human behavior naturally flows toward unexplored advantage until it meets a barrier. Consider how children instinctively push rules with permissive parents, but quickly stabilize with those who enforce clear boundaries. The power dynamic doesn't change in adulthood, only its expression becomes more sophisticated, disguised as just one more small request, or this slight exception to protocol. This explains the paradoxical observation that the kindest leaders often suffer the greatest disrespect over time. Their fundamental mistake is failing to understand that respect and fear aren't opposites, they're complementary elements of effective influence. The manager who helps teammates move on weekends yet never enforces standards will eventually find himself surrounded not by grateful allies but entitled dependents. The fear component isn't about being cruel, it's about establishing the psychological control that makes kindness interpreted as choice rather than necessity. The question then becomes, how can one balance these seemingly contradictory forces? Michael Chen's first day as principal at Westlake High was met with eye rolls from students and skepticism from faculty. The once prestigious school had descended into chaos under previous leadership. Tardiness epidemic, disrespectful behavior normalized, and teacher turnover at record highs. On day 3, Chen calmly expelled the star quarterback for behavior previous administrators had overlooked. By week 2, he'd fired a tenured teacher who'd been chronically underperforming. Neither action was delivered with malice, just matter-of-fact consequences delivered with almost surgical detachment. 6 months later, Westlake's transformation bordered on miraculous. The fascinating part? Chen was actually well-liked, having mastered the delicate art of being feared without being hated. The strategy begins with emotional discipline, maintaining a measured response that never reveals your full capacity for either warmth or severity. Like the mother who resolves playground disputes with a look that stops children in their tracks, then moments later warmly praises good behavior. The balance creates an environment where both extremes seem possible, but unpredictable. Notice how respected judges maintain courtroom control not through constant harshness, but through selective enforcement paired with fundamental fairness. The power comes from the controlled application of consequences rather than their severity. Those who master this approach understand that predictable harshness breeds resentment, while unpredictable fairness creates both respect and a healthy caution. The implementation requires 3 specific tactics. First, enforce boundaries early, rather than after repeated violations. The first transgression costs less to address than the 10th. Second, separate the person from the behavior in your response. This action is unacceptable rather than you are unacceptable. Third, create contrast through selective generosity. The leader who is occasionally unexpectedly generous after maintaining high standards creates loyalty that excessive niceness never achieves. What these principles create isn't fear of punishment, but fear of disappointment, a far more powerful and sustainable form of influence. The ultimate paradox emerges. Those who maintain this delicate balance of fear and respect create environments where explicit displays of power become increasingly unnecessary. What you've discovered today isn't just another strategy. It's a fundamental recalibration of how human influence actually works. The choice before you is clear. Continue playing by the flawed rulebook that prioritizes approval over effectiveness, or embrace the balanced power that comes from being strategically feared as well as genuinely respected. The path of purposeful fear isn't about becoming someone you're not. It's about stopping the exhausting performance of being less than you are. It's about reclaiming the natural authority that you've been surrendering in countless small moments of unnecessary accommodation. Begin today by identifying one area where your excessive niceness has created a pattern of disrespect. Perhaps with a colleague who consistently interrupts you, a friend who violates your boundaries, or a situation where your value isn't properly acknowledged. How would this scenario transform if you introduced the element of controlled, predictable consequences? What if you allowed yourself to be slightly less readable, slightly more selective with your warmth, and much more consistent with your boundaries? The psychological shift this creates isn't just external. It fundamentally changes how you perceive yourself and your right to command the space you occupy. I'm curious, which of these principles struck you as most counterintuitive to what you've been taught about influence and leadership? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Your insight might be exactly what another viewer needs to hear. If you're ready to master more psychological principles that others won't teach you, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Remember, in a world that constantly pushes you to seek approval at any cost, the most revolutionary act is establishing boundaries that cannot be crossed without consequence. Your new path to genuine influence begins now.